Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shelley Gehring, and I'm a program manager at MHP, Mass Housing Partnership. We appreciate you joining us today. I am very sorry about the time change. It actually wasn't technically a time change. It was a mistake that I made in promoting the incorrect time for this one. So I'm so sorry if that has been difficult for you. This is the second of 4 series. It's our Affordable Housing Trust and CPA conference broken up into 4 sessions. So today we're going to be focusing on affordable housing finance. At the end of January, on January 27th, we'll be looking at the developer perspective. So what a pro forma looks like, how a developer develops a affordable housing program for a particular site, balancing the interests of the community, of lenders, of the state, in adding resources to affordable housing development. So that's January 27th. And then February 3rd, we're going to be hearing from a couple communities, Salem and Brewster, and how they're supporting the creation of affordable housing locally. So we're asking that you keep yourself muted during this session and that you put any questions in the chat. We are going to be recording this session and it will be added to the housing toolbox in the next couple days. So we're going to start the recording in just a minute. And if you really do not want to be on that recording, you can just turn your camera off, although we do hope that you'll keep your camera on. And again, just put your questions in the chat, and Katie Bossy, my colleague Katie Bossy, and I will be monitoring those, and we'll be asking Ann your questions for you. So our presenter today is one of my colleagues, Ann Lewis. She is in our lending team. She's been a part of the lending team for several years and is currently the Director of Capital and Program Development at MHP. She has extensive experience in financing affordable housing and has actually helped develop some of our products at MHP. So Ann, you can share your screen and we're going to turn it over to Ann.
Hi all, let me make sure this is set up in the right way. All right, Shelley, am I sharing my screen?
Yes. Do you want to put it in slideshow?
Oh, yep. I
format?
thought it was there. One second. All right.
Looks
Are
good.
You seeing? Okay, great.
Yep.
One second. All right, welcome all. Thank you for attending this session. As Shelley said, my name is Ann Lewis. I've been at MHP for about 9 years, and I work in MHP's rental financing team. When MHP is not out working with communities to advance affordable housing throughout the state, much of our work is as an affordable housing lender. We provide mortgage debt for multifamily affordable rental housing with properties located across the state, varying in size and also in level of affordability.
So Ann, just wanted to point out, do you mean for your notes to be showing?
Oh, no, I don't. Let me switch.
There you go. That's good.
Okay. Okay. So, all right. Thanks all. Working with double screens here. And as an example, MHP finances many deeply affordable properties serving the lowest income households, as well as properties serving low and moderate income households. We finance new construction as well as the rehabilitation or refinance of existing buildings. And we finance 40B properties, which are often the only new affordable rental housing being built in their respective communities. In particular, my focus today is on the financing of deeply affordable rental housing, which requires development support in the form of subsidy, whether from the federal, state, or local level, in order to be financially feasible. I know that there are folks here with a variety of backgrounds on this call and with varying familiarity with affordable housing. And I suspect that some of the content will be new to some and a refresher for others. I'll try to pause at a few points in the presentation, but as Shelley mentioned, she and Katie will be taking questions and directing them when the time is right. So the goal of this session is to shed some light on the processes and financial dynamics that make up our affordable housing delivery system, which can seem at sometimes like a Rube Goldberg machine designed to accomplish a seemingly simple task, provide families and individuals with good housing that they can afford, but with steps and constraints can certainly drive us crazy sometimes. I think this complexity relates in part to how we have chosen as a society at this point to pay for affordable housing, with developers cobbling together investors, public funders, tax credits, etc. And the complexity relates to all the things that we seek to accomplish with new affordable housing, reaching the lowest income households, building in environmentally sustainable ways, designing projects that fit within communities, etc. These are all important goals, but each decision comes with a trade-off. I want to start out with defining some terms that may be obvious, but are worth reminding ourselves of today. When I talk about affordable in this context today, I'm talking about affordable with a capital A, which are apartments that have restrictions on the maximum amount of rent charged and restrictions on the income levels of the households who reside in them. These restrictions can be placed on the housing by various entities, whether at the federal, state, or local level. And the restrictions are likely associated with federal, state, or local funds that help to build or preserve the property. As long as the restrictions remain in place, the apartments will remain affordable to the households who live in them. One might also encounter affordable housing with a lowercase a, also known as naturally occurring affordable housing. It has no restrictions on the rent that it can charge or the household income of its residents, but is affordable nonetheless. However, there's nothing preventing a landlord or owner from raising the rents over time should the opportunity arise or market conditions change. So when an apartment has a restriction on the household's income level, we typically see the income levels broken down by percentage of the area median income, or AMI. As an example, when we use the term low income households in this particular context, we're talking about households earning below 80% of AMI. Very low income refers to households earning 50% or less than AMI, and extremely low income, or ELI, households earning 30% or less than AMI. And I've provided an example here what the 2020 HUD income limits are for the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy MSA, or what I'll refer to as the Metro Boston area for a one-person household. So you can see that to qualify for low income household under this definition, a one-person household in the Boston MSA would be earning less than $67,000. And these definitions are specific, or these limits are specific to the region and the number of people in the household. So they will change across the state and as the number of people in the household increases. A household's need for affordable housing is typically evaluated by a metric called housing cost burden, or the share of a household's income that it devotes to housing. Households with housing cost burdens pay more than 30% of their income towards housing, while severe housing cost burden households pay more than 50% of their income towards housing. This measure doesn't account for all the other factors that contribute to whether or not housing is affordable for a family. These can include dynamics such as where the housing is located with respect to where people work or where they get childcare, for instance. So it's one measure of the cost burden that a household might have in securing housing. So you can use these definitions to calculate the rents that would be affordable to a particular household at a particular income level. As an example, let's play this out for a household of 4, a very low income household of 4 in either Metro Boston or Barnstable County, which is on the Cape. To calculate the monthly affordable rent, you'd start with the area median income for either area. So in Metro Boston, the area median income for a household of 4 is about $120,000. You'd take 50% of that area median income to find the threshold level for a very low income household. I would just note here that in certain areas of the state, because our housing costs are so high, HUD in this calculation adjusts the rent limits accordingly. So you'll see that the Metro Boston 50% AMI number is not quite 50% of the AMI above it, but Barnstable County does not have a similar adjustment, and that number is 50% of its AMI. And then once you have the 50% AMI number, you translate that into an affordable rent by timesing that by 30%, which we define as our threshold for whether or not a household is housing cost burden, and then divide it by 12 to get the monthly income. So in this case, we're seeing about $1,600 would be an affordable rent for a household of 4, a very low income household of 4 living in the Boston area. As might be obvious from these numbers, if you have familiarity with the rental market in either of these areas, the fair market rents in these locations well exceed what would be standardly affordable to these households. So as an example, the HUD defined fair market rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in Metro Boston is a little under $3,000. So that metric is calculated by about 40% of the 40% percentile of rents for typical units in a local market. And that is well in excess of what we've calculated to be affordable for that type of household. In light of the high cost of housing throughout the state, putting together an affordable housing development is really a balancing act, as I'm sure many of you know, based on your involvement thus far in this world. The housing must be responsive to local needs in terms of who it's serving and at what income level, and with what kind of services. And simply put, the cost to develop the housing must be balanced by the sources. So the costs I've laid out on the left here, the sources on the right, and the income produced by the property. So which is necessarily going to be limited at a property that's renting its units at an affordable cost at a below market level. And it doesn't take much to get it out of balance. If even one of the many required elements here changes, including the time estimated to complete the project's development, the project may no longer be feasible or may require changes to its budget or scope or affordability in order to move forward. So to get into some of this balancing act, I'm going to run through budget basics for new construction. In this case, I'm going to use newly constructed housing as an example, so not a refinance or an acquisition of an existing building, but a building that's being built from the ground up. In a housing's development budget, there are sources, which I've shown on the right here, or money available to pay for the project. And there are uses on the left here, or what the money is used for. So the total sources have to equal the total uses. Uses of funds can include things like acquisition costs for purchasing land or buildings, construction cost, soft costs, which include the cost of legal, financing fees, etc., and developer fees and reserves. The sources in this case, I'm sort of limiting our scope of conversation here to debt, which is going to be limited in size by the property's income. Think of the parallel in some ways to a residential home mortgage. You can only take on as much debt as you can pay for through the income stream of the property. And subsidy sources, which I'll go through in more detail later. For an affordable property, subsidy sources provide the bulk of the project's equity. In the residential home mortgage parallel, this would be the down payment. Together with the debt, these must cover the uses in the development budget. The relationship between debt and equity, and in this case, debt and subsidy, is important. Our subsidy sources of equity are limited resources, whether they're awarded at the federal, state, or local level. But if we wish to provide housing that's affordable to the lowest income households, we will often need a subsidy to make up for the fact that the project's low rents cannot support a lot of debt. So this is a chart that I'm going to walk through. I think it's helpful for understanding some of the relationships here, and I'll return to it later on in the presentation because I know it's not necessarily easy to grasp at first glance. But along the x-axis here, I have target rents going from low to high, and on the y-axis, I have the equity required to develop a property at that target rent, or in this case, we're going to think of the equity as the subsidy required. And with each rent level across the x-axis, I've associated the household income level that could afford that rent level. So at the far left of the chart, those rent levels would be, in this example, affordable at 50% AMI. And you can see that those rent levels at the left end of the chart also have the greatest equity requirement. So that means that they can support the least amount of debt and they require the most amount of subsidy. And as you go across the chart, the equity requirement goes down as the income stream of the property through higher rents can support more debt and less subsidies requirements. So what we're trying to illustrate here is there's a huge demand for resources, and that demand is going to be stronger as we try to provide housing for the lowest income levels. I have a note in my presentation here to pause for some questions if there are any.
Not yet.
Okay, great. So how do subsidy resources get awarded? I'm going to go through pretty quickly here the process that the Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD, has to award subsidy. The DHCD is responsible for awarding both some federal resources and state resources, and they have a funding round typically once a year for the bulk of applicants, where developers can submit applications for a variety of resources that are funded by DHCD. Each proposal is scored based on state priorities outlined in the state's Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP. The QAP is a guiding document that is required for the federal LIHTC program, and I'll get more into that in a second. DHCD publishes this annually, and it describes how it intends to award the federal low-income housing tax credit, as well as other federal and state resources. So in Massachusetts' case, the priorities included in the QAP also apply to the state's other housing programs. And I'll just say that there are a lot of priorities baked into the QAP. And I think this is a good example of that we're trying to do many things through our affordable housing delivery system here in Massachusetts. So DHCD has outlined priority categories, five main priority categories here. One is for extremely low-income households. Another is for investment in distressed neighborhoods. So in this case, there must also be a broader community support and a revitalization strategy. They have prioritized the preservation of existing affordable housing, new production for families in high opportunity neighborhoods, which they have a very specific definition around, and new production in communities with affordable housing stock below 12%. I've included here a link, and I think these slides will be shared, to DHCD's Qualified Allocation Plan, which has much more detail on all these things. So through this competitive process, the state awards both state and federal resources, as I mentioned. The biggest federal resource is the federal low-income housing tax credit. And this is the single largest subsidy for low-income rental housing across the country at this point. And it is a dollar-to-dollar credit against an investor's tax liability taken over 10 years. And I will get into the mechanics of that program a little bit later in the presentation. DSG also awards some federal home program grants. These are block grants, which are designed to help create affordable housing. And I've included some links here on the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, in case people want to follow up after the presentation. The state also awards, through this QAP process, housing programs funded by the state's housing bond. So this is kind of an alphabet soup of a lot of resources that are really meaningful to projects, but all have different program requirements and different target residents that they serve. The biggest ones here are the state LIHTC program, which is structured similarly to the federal LIHTC program, and the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And last, but certainly not least, especially for this audience, are local resources. These vary by community, but can be enormously impactful for a given housing development's financial feasibility. Some examples are land, which can be donated or steeply discounted, funds allocated through a city or town's Community Preservation Act, or CPA, or local home or CDBG funding. Municipalities may be in a consortium with other towns or cities in the allocation of those funds. I would just note that for each of these sources and the preceding federal and state resources, they are likely each to come with their own restrictions on a property, and these restrictions can't conflict. So back to our budget here. So we've talked a little bit about the sources that come through, especially those subsidy sources. And as I said, the total sources must equal the total uses. And now we're going to move on to the operating side of the property. So for new construction, it operates the same as a refinance or an acquisition. The income must support the expenses, and also must be greater than the expenses in order to support any debt payments. The income here I've put into some broad buckets. We have the residential rental income. That's going to differ by, it's going to be different based on the affordability level of the property. So with a more deeply affordable property, there's going to be less rental income coming in. And we also, in determining sort of initial feasibility of a housing development, we typically apply a vacancy percentage. So I go into a project example later on in the presentation, I'm assuming a 5%, which is typical sort of threshold vacancy percentage that a lender or underwriter will apply. Most lenders will also can look at commercial income, although this has evolved and changed in most recently in COVID times. But typically a lender will only accept commercial income up to a certain percent of the total income because it is can be viewed as potentially higher risk. And then the expenses here, I've bucketed them into some categories too: administrative costs, maintenance of the property, utilities. And in this budget example and balancing the budget, your net operating income here is your income minus your expenses, and that must be greater than the permanent mortgage debt payments. So that net operating income, or the NOI number, is really going to drive how much debt the property can take on, because that is the chunk of money that's going to be available to pay the mortgage debt payments. So on this slide, I've brought together the development sources and uses and the income expenses. And all of these things are intertwined and can affect each other in some really important ways that becomes relevant in whether a given housing development will be feasible or not. So as an example here, as I've said, that NOI must be able to support the project's debt payments. And if NOI cannot support the debt amount, the amount of subsidies may have to increase. And as I said before, these subsidies are scarce and under really high demand. So that balancing act can be pretty tricky sometimes. I'm just going back to this chart because now we've brought in the dynamics of a lot of the budget, lining up these pieces and parts of the budget to reinforce that if you don't have enough NOI, which would be declining as you go from higher affordability level over to the left, lower affordability level on this chart, you're going to need more subsidy resources to fill that gap in your budget as the amount of debt that you can take on decreases. The number and types of subsidy sources may also affect the balancing act here. So as a housing development seeks more subsidy resources, those might come in smaller and more numerous chunks of money, and that increases complexity, and complexity takes time and it takes money. And so that's going to be one more balancing act to consider here. And then each subsidy resource comes with its own requirements, and those can have a meaningful impact on both the income available if the subsidy resource comes with a restriction on it. It can also impact things like the administrative cost if the subsidy resource requires annual or monthly reporting on the property's operation or households served. And many subsidy sources, especially those that are seeking to serve the lowest income households, come with requirements for resident service provision. So that's going to be an expense, an ongoing operating expense of the property. So maybe I'll pause there and see if there are any questions.
We do not have questions at this point. So I don't know if it's that you're so thorough or people are trying to absorb it. I don't know. But just a reminder to everyone that you can put questions in the chat. Okay, so we do have a question that just came in asking about what is the commercial income?
Yep, so that can be a lot of different things. So the most common commercial income sort of category that we see at MHP are things like commercial spaces on the ground floor of a multi-floor apartment building. So it can be any sort of tenant. Sometimes there are commercial tenants that are associated with the developer, and sometimes it's just sort of neighborhood businesses that are going to operate in a portion of the space that is being built.
And another question of, can you give some examples of what resident services might look like?
Yep. So let's see. So some subsidy sources are specifically designed to secure housing for formerly homeless families, and that those families might require support in everything from securing childcare to employment counseling, those kinds of services that really support those families in the place that they're living.
And another question, if you can explain a little bit how these requirements that are attached to sources. So this question is, if there's a local subsidy from a housing trust using CPA funds, will the project owner pay and manage the admin costs and the resident services, or does the housing trust do that? Does the funding entity do that? So if you can talk about the relationship between these requirements of sources and the developer's responsibility.
Okay, yeah, I can take a shot, and then Shelley, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's typically the developer's responsibility to include the costs of complying. I'll just call it compliance costs. So any sort of reporting or compliance reporting that goes along with a subsidy source would be included in the administrative costs in the development's budget. There might be some other local sources that for which that operates in a different way, but that would be my understanding.
And to piggyback on that, the Affordable Housing Trust would not oversee resident services, that's part of the project, the development, that the trust would not oversee that.
Correct. Yep, correct. And I would say, regardless of the subsidy sources, there are many CDCs, developer owners who have robust resident services, robust resident service programming, built into the bigger picture of their housing. And so that's a priority for many operators of affordable housing to provide that. So it's not always something that is tied directly to a subsidy source, but it certainly can be related.
So do you want to comment on the risk from a lending perspective, the risk introducing commercial into a development?
Yeah, so when we underwrite commercial, and I would like put a big asterisk on this as sort of pre-COVID, when we underwrite commercial income, we only underwrite a certain percentage of that income. And so for us, it is a more risky income stream, and we only allow it to be a certain percentage of the total income that we're underwriting at the property. And in underwriting, I would just comment over the course of the pandemic, we certainly have, as with other lenders, taken a closer look at the commercial income assumptions at a property and are approaching them very conservatively.
So can you also give why do we see commercial as more risky?
Let's see. I think, we have over the course of underwriting a affordable housing development, there is a lot of market analysis, a lot of proven demand for the rental units, knowing the housing market in the state or in a particular area. This is our bread and butter, our expertise. We know how to become secure in taking on that risk. And I think commercial income is we're a little bit less comfortable with that risk as a permanent lender.
So I just want to point out to the audience that doesn't mean that mixed use is not appropriate in many locations, because in many locations that is the best format. But just to increase your sensitivity that from a lending perspective, that it can seem more risky, and then that puts pressure on the developer and what the developer might propose. I don't know if you might say it differently, Anne, but just wanted to point out that in many of our communities, the mixed use is what's existing. And so you would want to add a mixed use development where there's commercial on the first floor so that it fits in that space. There's another question, Anne, of are there ways that a community can subsidize lower AMI units, area median income units, in the operating budget versus a development subsidy?
Yeah, so there are certainly, so I don't get into this in this particular example or presentation, but in many affordable housing developments that we finance, there are certainly operating subsidies at play in many of them. Most of them are federal or state funded housing, project-based housing vouchers. So subsidy that supports a household's rent payments. And Shelley, you might have more insight here, but you know, I think there are certainly communities who have tried to step up in doing some of that operating income support work. But yeah, that is an option, I think.
That's great. I think that you should move on.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to just walk through a example housing development and walk through the budget elements that we saw in the previous slides. This is a hypothetical, but I've tried to draw in some project components and dynamics that are pretty common to what we see in considering financing. So in this example, I've put the development in the Cape in Dennis. It's going to be 60 units of affordable family rental housing, a mix of bedroom sizes, and for the purposes of the budget, I'm assuming that the land is owned by the town. So for our 60 units, I've made a matrix up top. Most of these units are going to be affordable at 60% AMI, which is the most common affordability level that you see for a low-income housing tax credit. And then 10% of the units are going to be affordable at 30% AMI. That's that extremely low income threshold. And I've done a mix across the bedroom types. The middle table here shows the household income limits for each of those affordability levels and bedroom sizes. And then I've translated that into a monthly rent by taking the income limit, timesing it by 30%, which is that housing cost burden threshold, and then dividing it by 12 to get to the monthly rent level. And then those monthly rents, I am calculating a total income at the property by taking the monthly rent, timesing it by the number of units that the development is going to have at that particular rent level and bedroom size.
And something happened to your volume.
Oh. Can you hear me now? Yes?
I can hear you.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear her.
I can hear her too. I can hear her.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay, well, I'll keep going.
I'm sorry, it's me. It's me. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So for each unit type and affordability level, I've translated it to a total income, and then I'm backing out a 5% of that income for a vacancy assumption. So that's the risk that the unit remains vacant and that the owner can't capture that income through a rent. I'm also assuming that the project might have other income. For this purpose, I've just put in a laundry income, but certainly we see things like parking income, storage income, a variety of things there. And then the bottom number is the total effective income at $838,000 or almost $14,000 per unit. For the property's expenses, I've laid out here what's a pretty standard operating expense budget. At $8,500, this is typical of what we see, if not a little low, for projects, you know, in Metro Boston, particularly for our most deeply affordable housing developments will typically have a higher per unit operating expense, but $8,500 is not bad, and those are broken out across, you know, admin, maintenance, utilities, real estate taxes, all that stuff. So back to this NOI number, or the net operating income, is the income less the expenses. So in this case, comparing the operating income to the operating expenses here, we're getting a net operating income of $328,000. And now I'm going to switch quickly to the development uses, and then we'll link them back together at the end. So in this case, the development uses include an acquisition cost. It's quite low because I'm assuming that the town is donating the land at a very low cost to, or essentially donating the land to the developer in this case. The construction costs are the bulk of the budget here. There are substantial soft costs. So again, those are things like financing fees or legal costs. And there are also reserves and developer fee and overhead included here for a total development cost of almost 22 million or 365,000 per unit. And again, this is, those costs can vary regionally. They can vary by the size of the project, by all sorts of different components that relate to the development. And I've kind of gone over this. So we've assumed minimal acquisition costs. And I would just note that the developer fee and overhead are capped by the state. There are limitations on what that number can be. So we have, from our previous diagram, we have 3 proposed sources here. I'm saying that we're going to have debt. We're going to utilize the federal LIHTC program, and we might need some additional subsidy. So there are a couple of tests to evaluate in order to think about how much debt the property can support. And one of them is a loan to value evaluation. And that is the ratio of debt to property value, or debt divided by the property value.
So Anne, I'm wondering actually, if before you get too far into this, if we can do a few kind of questions that have come in to clarify some things. Is that okay?
Yep.
So one is, if you can just speak a little bit more directly to how does the developer determine the mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms?
Yep. So at a basic level, part of it is a market analysis. So evaluating the need in a given community based on household size. We typically think of 2 and 3 plus bedroom sizes being the most appropriate and supportive of families with multiple people in the household. So typically, unless it's a development that's going to be restricted to, going to be age restricted, going to house seniors only, you'll see a broad range of bedroom sizes. And some subsidy sources come with bedroom size requirements. We, as a lender and the state, we do prioritize for family housing bedroom sizes that are 2 and 3 bedrooms to really support households with multiple family members in them. But it does vary depending on the development.
And these numbers here are for the year, annual?
So for the slide that I'm looking at right now?
Yes.
Yes, they're annual. Yep.
Yeah. And the difference between, so when you said 5% vacancy, the difference between, what does that actually mean, and why do you put in 5% vacancy?
So, yep, so I calculated, the first number I calculated, let me go back a slide for a second. So just as an example, for the 1 bedroom units here, renting at 60% of AMI, so that's the 182,000 in the top left of this table. That would be the total income at that bedroom type and affordability type for the whole year. If those units, let's say there are 10 units in that category, if all 10 of those units were fully occupied for that whole year. And the way we underwrite them is to assume that there is less than 100% occupancy for the full year. So in this case, I'm going to assume 5% vacancy. So the 9,000 there is simply 5% of the 182,000 number.
Thanks. And then under what category of expenses would resident services fall?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't include that as a specific category here. We actually, and I should have because I was talking about it. In our operating expense sort of chart of accounts that we use for underwriting, it's actually a totally separate line item.
Okay. And the difference between management fee and administrative expense, what is the difference between management fee and administrative expense? Why isn't management fee part of admin?
Yeah, that's a good question. So oftentimes there'll be a like a third-party manager for properties that's independent from the owner of the property, and the contract between the owner and that third-party management company will include a management fee. That's a certain percentage of the, it's usually calculated as a certain percentage of the property's operating income. And administrative costs are sort of everything else that goes into running the property, the staff on site. It includes all those compliance costs that we were talking about earlier that might relate to the subsidy sources of the property, those kinds of things.
And is charging tenants for laundry, is that pretty standard in rental developments?
Yeah, if it's a common laundry, yep.
Mm-hmm. And there is a comment and a question as well around single family affordable housing, and do developments match the community, and in terms of if it's multifamily or single family. And I don't want to get too much into that, but if you maybe would comment on how MHP looks at that when a sponsor is seeking financing from us.
So can you just repeat the beginning, like part of the question there?
So the comment is that this person has seen single family development, affordable single family development instead of multifamily, and questioning whether that's the best use of land, and not necessarily getting into that. But when we finance a development, and if it is single family with an affordable component, how do we look at that? How do we consider that?
Mm-hmm. So MHP finances only multifamily rental properties. So we don't finance home ownership, for example, or affordable home ownership. So I just want to clarify that. And in terms of the distinction between, the density, I guess, would be the driving point behind this question. I think that we certainly finance developments of varying density, and I think that really varies by community. And I think we as an organization feel strongly that for any given community, there's a multifamily option that can, fit well within that community. And but it could look different in different places. Okay, should I move forward, Shelley?
I think move on, yeah.
Okay. All right, so we were talking about LTV. So in this example, lenders typically allow an LTV of 80%. So if a property has an appraised value of $2.5 million, then the debt is going to be limited to 80% of that $2.5 million, or $2 million. Another test that a lender will do is around the debt service coverage ratio, and that's the ratio of net operating income, or NOI, to the debt service, which is the amount of payment towards the debt. And that includes both principal and interest. And lenders, as an example, typically require a debt service coverage ratio of 1.2, although this does really vary depending on your lender, on the source of capital, on certain characteristics of the property. But as an example, let's assume a 1.20 debt service coverage ratio. If the property has an NOI of 150,000 then the debt payments can't exceed 125,000, or 1.2 divided by 150,000. So this is like going back to your high school algebra here, having to do like a little bit of shifting around, but that's the basic of a calculation to sort of limit the amount of debt so that it is cushioned above the property's net operating income. And then you can use one can use some financial calculations to generate the max total debt based on that debt payments, using assumptions around what the interest rate is and what the loan's amortization is. So in this case, we're sort of backing into the debt number of 1.9 million. And then I'm just going to return, I think for the last time, to this chart, because this concept of NOI comes back here. So we're talking here directly about a test that limits debt based on the property's income. And again, you can see that the debt is going to be more and more limited as you go to lower and lower affordability levels, and you're going to be required more subsidy simply because the property won't have the resources through its rental income to support as much debt. So these tests, both tests have to be satisfied in this case. So you have the LTV test that's returning a debt limit of 2 million. You have the debt service coverage ratio test that's returning a coverage limit of 1.9 million. So in this case, you can't exceed the lower of the two requirements, that 1.9 million. So I'm going to use the debt service coverage test here. We're going to assume that the LTV test will not be limiting in this case. And I'm going to take our NOI from the CAPE example of 328,000. We're going to apply the debt service coverage ratio of 1.2. And then we're going to arrive at our maximum debt service by dividing the NOI by that 1.2 ratio. And that's going to result in the 273,000 number. And then I've assumed an interest rate of 4% and amortization of 30 years. And that's going to land us at a maximum debt of $4.8 million in the case of this property. So then we're also assuming that we're going to use federal 9% LIHTC here as a large portion of the equity. The basics of the low-income housing tax credit program are that it's an indirect federal subsidy used to finance affordable rental housing. It was created in the 80s. It's a program of the IRS. It's not, and some would say that's one of the reasons why it has stuck around so long, because it's not a budget item. It doesn't need to be approved annually. Investors who receive the credit get a reduction in their federal income tax liability in exchange for an equity investment. And in order to utilize the credit, the development must be affordable for at least 30 years, and it must meet certain minimum affordability levels. And it does include a fair amount of compliance requirements in order to utilize it. So I'm going to try to walk through the basics here. I would reemphasize that this is a complicated program, and I did provide some links earlier in the presentation, which I think are useful overviews. But essentially, the federal government will allocate the amount of federal tax credits annually based on the state's population. And in our state's case, those credits get allocated to DHCD, who then awards them based on the priorities in the QAP, in the Qualified Allocation Plan, to affordable housing developers and owners who submit proposals for projects in a funding round in which the credits are being awarded. And then in most cases, the developers will go out and market and sell the credits to a tax credit investor. There are looking to find someone who has the tax liability for which the tax credit will be valuable. And once they find a tax credit investor, that investor can take the tax credits, and in exchange for that, they're making an equity investment in the development. And then the developer owner will have to secure whatever additional financing is needed. So mortgage debt or other public subsidy or other financing. So the tax credit is designed to fill a substantial and meaningful portion of the sources in a development budget, but it's not going to fill everything. And here are these links once more in case folks want to dig more in. So in this example, when we're sizing making assumptions about the LIHTC equity that's going to go into the project, we have to define certain eligible costs that are part of this calculation. So that's the construction cost, it's most of the soft costs. You can't count land acquisition. There are a lot of rules involved in this program that I'm going to sort of gloss over a lot of it, but this is the basic calculation. So that 19 million there is going to be our eligible basis for the purposes of calculating this LIHTC equity. We get to use all 100% of that because we're assuming that all the units are affordable at 60% AMI or less. That's the affordability threshold that we're going to meet through the LIHTC program. And we're using, in this case, 9% tax credits, which are, so we're going to use an application percentage of 9% here, and that goes into how you calculate the annual credit amount, which is the eligible basis, that 19 million times 100% times 9% to get an annual credit amount of 1.7 million. So that's what's sort of on the table for the investor. And in this case, let's say the developer goes out and markets the tax credits. They find an investor who's willing to pay 90 cents on the dollar for the tax credits. And they can claim this credit annually over 10 years. So the total equity that gets put in upfront into the development is the 1.7 annual credit amount times 90% times 10 years. So that's that 15.7 million at the bottom. So let's line up our development uses here, and that's the 21.9 million in total costs. It's what we have thus far of 4.8 million in mortgage debt, the 15.7 million in LIHTC equity. We still have a gap in order to make the sources meet the uses. So in this case, we have a gap of 1.4 million. And I'm going to assume that we're covering that gap through local CPA funds and one of those state housing bond programs that we looked at earlier, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, of a little shy of 1 million to make our uses equal our sources. So we've balanced the project at this point. We've come up with sources that equal our uses. And maybe I should pause here on time. Can you give me a time update, Shelley?
Yeah, so we have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, so I think we have time to go into this. So I've been sort of trying to emphasize how this is a balancing act. And I'm going to walk through a little example of how things can become unbalanced. So as an example, let's assume that a group of abutters at this property on the Cape request that the project size be reduced from 60 units to 40 units. Without sort of walking through the math, it can be hard to see how this could have financial ramifications for the feasibility of the project, but in many cases it does and will. So I have shifted the unit matrix from 60 units to 40 units. I've tried to keep the general bedroom mix the same, but reduce the total number of units of the property. And that has understandably reduced the total operating income, just simply by there's fewer units bringing in rental income. So it's gone from 838,000 down to 556,000. I've also reduced the operating expenses, but the sticky part here is that not all the operating expenses are going to scale down with the decrease in units. So in this case, I've highlighted administrative costs and maintenance costs as an example for expense line items that may remain the same even with a change in units. So you can think of staffing at a property, the amount of work that has to go on to maintain the grounds of the property. Those things aren't necessarily going to reduce in cost with a building of 40 units versus a building of 60 units. And so even though we have reduced the total expenses, we still have a greatly reduced net operating income of $205,000 because we haven't reduced the operating expenses by the same amount that we've reduced the operating income. And likewise, on the development budget side, not all development costs are going to scale down with a decrease in units. So in this example, the acquisition cost remains the same for the land. And I've also assumed that the site costs, which are development costs associated with preparing the land for construction, dealing with any pre-existing conditions that might exist at the property before construction, those are going to remain the same. And I'm also assuming that the soft costs remain the same. So these financing fees, legal costs, all the things that for these particular developments are often related to the complexity of the financing and the number of funders involved are unlikely to decrease as you make the property smaller. So those are staying the same. So you can see the total costs have come down somewhat substantially, but the per unit cost is now a whole lot higher. As we mentioned earlier, the federal LIHTC equity, the biggest portion of that depends on the construction costs. And so those are that amount of equity that comes into the deal from that tax credit is going to scale down lower construction costs. And with all this, the funding gap has now grown by over 1 million. We have a lower NOI, we can support less debt, and we now have a bigger gap to fill. So we are no longer in balance. And it's one example there of the kind of considerations that have an impact on project feasibility and the financing of a affordable housing development. And with that, I think I've reached the end. There are more questions.
Yeah, there are. That was fantastic, Anne. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So one question came in with the different subsidy sources that you referenced. Are these available for mixed income developments where only a portion of the units are affordable?
Yes, but I say yes, but it depends. The federal LIHTC program itself is can be used in a mixed income property. There are sort of minimum affordability thresholds within that program to have at least 40% of the units affordable at 60% AMI, for example. That is one affordability threshold through the LIHTC program, but that leaves room for a mix of incomes. And certainly the different subsidy sources often target households at different income levels. I would just say that, because it gets harder and harder for a project to be feasible if you are serving the lowest income households, there's more subsidy available for the development of the lowest income units. And so to the extent that a project includes units affordable to higher income levels or market rate units, there's not going to be it's going to be less accompanying subsidies to support that development.
We oftentimes hear references to workforce housing. Is there a standard area median income that's tied to what workforce housing means? And does MHP finance this housing?
Yeah, so workforce housing, it depends on the program, but typically it's defined from 80% AMI up to, it could be up to 120% AMI. And MHP certainly does finance that income level or that like workforce housing segment. There are several programs out there with subsidy to support workforce housing development. And we certainly have provided the permanent mortgage debt on properties that include units affordable at those levels.
So a question was brought up around restrictions, that oftentimes our communities like to see affordable restrictions in perpetuity, but you referenced shorter restrictions. Would you just speak to 30-year restrictions versus other length of restrictions?
Mm-hmm. So so that's, we finance many properties in which the town or another entity has a affordability restriction in perpetuity, and that, the most restrictive restriction will be the guiding one. So that is certainly possible and happens in many cases. You'll have overlapping restrictions, and the one that's in perpetuity will govern the property.
I guess I should turn that around. What is the minimum that the state requires, for example, inclusion on the subsidized housing inventory? Is it 30 years, a minimum of 30-year restriction? Laura?
Sorry. Yes, for new construction, it's 30 years. Oftentimes the in perpetuity will be, except in the case of foreclosure, where then it would revert back to 25% at 80%, would be what would be in perpetuity, surviving foreclosure. You can have in perpetuity that doesn't survive foreclosure for the rest of the units.
Okay. And then, Anne, have we seen investors less interested in LIHTC with the pandemic? Has the pandemic impacted interest in investments in the low-income housing tax credits? Do you know?
I might have to defer to one of my colleagues there or follow up on exact numbers there. But I think on the investor side, we have seen more conservative underwriting, in the same way that we're trying to be thoughtful about reserves, for example, in developments that are going to be going into lease up and being built during this period. In a lot of cases, I don't think we've seen the value of the tax credit decline. So I don't know that we've seen substantial reductions in the amount of equity that's going into a given project's development budget. But there's certainly been more conservative underwriting in many cases.
So we're going to wrap up with a couple just comments and questions. So one is the comment: if CPA funds are in the deal, does the restriction need to be in perpetuity? The CPA statute does say that if you're acquiring a real property interest, that the restriction must be in perpetuity. And there was a question around how much do local communities contribute to the equity in affordable housing developments, and it's all across the board. So some communities contribute as much as $30,000 per unit. Some, it comes out to less than that. In many cases, those are CPA funds. But Anne, I'm going to ask you to end on this question of trying to better understand MHP's role. So in the lending. So do developers apply to MHP instead of directly through commercial lenders? Do you broker independent project finance or provide bulk financing? So I'm going to ask you to end on clarifying MHP's role in this.
So developers can apply directly to us for financing. Through our website, the MHP website, there's a rental financing landing page, which provides detail on a number of our financing programs and some contact information for folks on our team. So yeah, we have lending relationships with borrowers throughout the state. Those borrowers are a real mix of sizes and some, for-profit, some nonprofit, a lot of community development corporations throughout Massachusetts, and for developments of all sizes.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for your presentation. It was great as usual. And thanks for all of the questions and comments. I will do a little bit of follow-up offline, and you're welcome to reach out to me, to Anne, to others at MHP. We thank you for participating. The recording will go online in the next day or two. And sorry for some of the snafus with this, but we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.